Okay, picking up where we left off, we're on page 250 talking about the fields in the etc. password file. So the next one on the list is your home directory. So it's almost always going to be /home something, right? And then it is possible, however, that when you have a home directory, it could be my home directory could be on a mounted folder, right? Not that you could tell by looking at this, but I'm just saying it may be that home /image grade doesn't actually exist in the partition that we're in. Maybe it's actually grafted on with a mount command someplace. Yeah, kind of cool. Okay. And then the login shell, typically that's going to be bin bash, but there are some other options. And so what does something like false mean? False just means whenever you attempt to log in and you happen to have that shell, it's just going to immediately terminate. It's going to return false. Just returns an indication of an error. There's another one basically called no login, which basically does the same thing, except it just gives you a kind of a little better, cleaner kind of an answer of what's going on. So right now, we only have a few legitimate login shells, and then we have quite a few of the kind of ones that are designed to prevent you from accidentally logging into one of those accounts. There is one called change shell. It's CHSH, change shell, that will allow you to pick some other shell. Back in the day, I used to like a shell called corn shell. I know, it's a stupid thing. But anyway, David Korn wrote this thing, and I kind of liked it, and so I used the corn shell, but hey. Okay, so we talked about the etc. shadow and reason why it got pulled, right? So read permission obviously is significantly reduced. These entries are generated automatically by the add user, delete user, password, those kind of things. You don't have to go in there and edit anything by hand, heaven forbid. Now, if you were to edit one of these files by hand, either edit the password file by hand or edit the shadow file by hand, it is distinctly possible that you could get them out of synchronization. And so there's a command called pwconv. I think it was originally like convert. But anyway, what that will do is that will get them back into synchronization. It'll add whatever entry is missing and do the little thing. Okay, so one of the things you need to look at is the data that's in password. I mean in shadow. Doggone it! I keep getting these things backwards. It helps to get focus. Okay. Okay, there's a whole bunch of fields in here. Let's just go through them. All right. So the first one, of course, is the login name. It has to match. That makes sense. The next is the hashed password, which is in my case the only legitimate one, or there's one for Bob too, is this long thing. Everyone else just has a placeholder, right? Not a big deal. The last password change. Okay, now the last password change here is an encoded date. Okay, so don't get too excited about what that number actually means. What does 18,113 actually mean? Just take my word for it that that's an encoded date. The minimum number of days between changes, which should be 0, and the maximum number of days between changes, which in our case would probably be 9999999. Now, let's talk about what that means. Minimum days between changes. So I could set it up so you have to wait at least a week before you can change your password. Okay, I could. And then the maximum days between changes, that's the password aging. That's the thing that says, whoa, after 60 days, I want you to change your password, or 90 days, or 120 days, or whatever the number is. Cool? The next one is the number of days of warning that you get if your password is about to expire. So 7 days is what you would get saying, hey, your password is getting ready to expire. And it'll remind you every day for 7 days until it finally does expire. And then the day of the account expiration, which luckily in our case is left empty. So whenever you use like user mod, you can use user mod to go in and make those kind of changes. User mod, we used user mod to change like the group membership, right? But you can also use user mod to like set the minimum password, all those kinds of things. Okay, on page 254, they talk about the group thing. So again, we've done this before. Okay, so the group name, the hash password, I don't know of anyone who's ever used the password feature on a group. I'm just saying. It does exist, I just haven't seen it. The group ID, and then of course the comma separated list of groups. Now, one more time. By just looking at this, is there any way to tell for sure which one of these groups is the primary group that also appears in the password file? Can you tell? I mean, you might be able to infer from the name down here, like I have an Emmett Gray one that got created, but does that mean that I'm always, that just because when it was created I got assigned that, does that mean that's what my current primary group ID is? So by looking at this, can you tell? No. I can tell what my group membership is, but I can't tell which one is the primary. Is that a big deal, not knowing what the primary is? No. Okay. So add user typically creates a group with the same name as the user, which is a little weird, okay, I'll admit. But obviously you could go in and make some changes. So group add, group mod, and group delete would be the things that you would use to make changes. Okay, so let's just do, on page 255, they talk about the manual steps that you would have to do if you were going to do this by hand. And thank goodness we don't have to do it by hand. So here's what you would have to do. You would have to add a user. You would have to edit the password file, okay? Edit the shadow file. I don't even know how I would create a hashed password. Edit the group file. Create a password for the user, with the password command. Create a home directory to include changing the file ownership and all the rest of that stuff. Change the owner and group and permissions, and then copy the startup files, the standard startup files that everyone gets, which I happen to have right here. So here, the kinds of things that you would expect that a brand new naked account would have in it. Like if you're using Bash, you're going to have a Bash RC and a Bash profile. And, if you're using all these other things, and here's some of the things that would appear. So that's what you would have to do to pull this thing off. But as you can probably imagine, that's not exactly the right way to do this, right? So if you absolutely positively had to edit the password file for whatever reason, okay, then there's a special editor called VIPW. And VIPW, by the way, the VIPW doesn't actually have, you can configure that to use some other editor. It's still called VI, but when you run VIPW, what it's going to do is it's going to create a series of locks so that you can't have like two administrators editing the password file simultaneously. That would be really, really bad. So the VIPW command, all it basically does is maintain locks to prevent any concurrency issues, okay? That's what it does. Okay, so if you're required to edit the group, it'd be a VIGR, okay, that kind of thing. Hopefully you won't ever actually have to do that. I'm just saying that it might. Where are these prototype files actually found? Well, there's actually a folder called skeleton. Doesn't that sound kind of funky? So there's a skeleton file, and it's usually in etc. skel. So I'm going to go to, if I spelled it right. So here are those prototype files. In other words, whenever I create a user, it's going to go here and copy those guys into it. So these are the prototypes, the skeletons, as you may. On page 261, they start talking about scripts. remember the add user and del user guy? Those are actually a Perl script. Yeah, that's a Perl script. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here, because there's a thing called add user, and there's a thing called user add. And then there's a thing called del user, and there's a thing called user del. So the ones with the user in the front, the user add and user del, those are the low-level things that don't that all you. If you type user del, Bob, it's not. It's just gonna say, okay, dude, whatever, and just do it. Likewise, if you just create a user like that, it'll just say, done. We're done. The other one will prompt you for information, like, hey, would you like me to go through and take ownership of files? Would you like me to delete their profile? Or when you're adding, what's the guy's real name and what's the that kind of stuff. And so I prefer using the the higher ones where the verb is first, okay, right? Add user and del user, or the high level commands. That's why Ubuntu recommends you do that. So as you can probably imagine, there's a configuration. So if I go back up here to config, and I don't know how many configs there are. We're about to find out. Haha, hardly any. Oh, helps if it's, I meant that. Okay, there's a bunch of these guys. So there, for example, is the add user config and their del user config. So this is how you would tweak that little guy to say, for example, okay, I'm getting ready to create, so, do I want to support dots in the name and that kind of stuff? That's where those configuration things are kept. If you look at the man page for add user, it gives you tons and tons and tons of other things where you can tweak. So a newly created account typically is disabled by default, and then whenever you assign a password to it, it automatically enables it. Okay? So typically when you build an account, they're just built, boom, but they're just disabled and waiting for you to run the password command one time. And as soon as you type the password command, boom, it enables the account and you're ready to rock and roll. On page 264, they talk about removing an account. Yeah, you got to do that. So after an employee leaves, so you disable their account. That makes sense. Do you delete their home directory files? Well, I guess you could. Or maybe there's something in there that belongs to the organization that you need to keep. So maybe what you ought to do is to take ownership over there and not delete them, but change the ownership, maybe to root even. Do something, but don't throw them away. I mean, that's just your choice. And then what about email? What about cron jobs? What about shared files? I mean, there's a heck of a lot of things. So this is what del user would do. Remember the verb first. It's going to prompt you for deleting the user files. Do you want to do that, yes or no? It says, hey, would you like to back this up before we do that? And like, yeah, if I said yes to the delete, it's going to say, yeah, let me just kind of back that up someplace. And then remove files owned by the user. In other words, search down, do a search and destroy on the entire file system for any file that belonged to the user. I don't know about that. Maybe what I want to do is go through and find those files, and then I'll decide whether or not I want to whack them. And then scrub any empty groups that might occur. So that's what happens inside this cool little Perl script. So if I wanted to find all orphaned files, I could do that myself. There is a cool little technique using the find command that was specifically designed for this scenario where I'm hunting for all files that have a user ID that no longer exist in the password file. But since we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, we'll demo that in just a few.